Hello, and welcome back to the Thecrimereel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life and crimes of Frank Coppola. Frank Joseph Coppola was born on the 25th of February 1944 in Portsmouth, Virginia. He was the third child born to Vincent and Mary Rose Coppola, who already had an 8-year-old daughter by the name of Rose Marie and a 4-year-old son by the name of Vincent. Frank developed into a tough kid who grew up in a difficult neighbourhood. He was physically strong, a good athlete, and at least in his younger years was a good student. Less than a year later, Frank decided that he wanted to become a priest. In 1958, he left Portsmouth, Virginia, and enrolled in a 6-year Catholic seminary just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. However, within a year, he decided that this lifestyle was not for him and decided to return home. He went to high school in his hometown of Portsmouth, where he started playing basketball. He won a sports scholarship to the Old Dominion University in nearby Norfolk in Virginia. He completed his freshman year at the university, but then suddenly dropped out following a rumoured disciplinary hearing. On 2nd of June 1965, at the age of 21, Frank married Alice Lee Dupree Bridges. By this point, he had decided to pursue a career in the police force and became a policeman on the 9th of August 1965. Frank reportedly had a quick temper and always liked to be perceived as a tough guy. He walked the beat in some of Portsmouth's worst areas, but after less than 2 years in the force, he ran into trouble. In 1966, he was suspended for allegedly providing false information to protect another officer who had been accused of beating a prisoner. With the pressure of these accusations mounting against him, Frank resigned from the force in 1967. A series of short-lived jobs followed. Frank worked as a car salesman, a mechanic, and a bouncer, but none of these jobs lasted long. He spent a short time working as a hot dog vendor, but it is reported that the stall went bust after Frank gave away food to those people who were unable to pay. On the 18th of February 1967, Frank and Alice welcomed their first son, also named Frank Joseph Coppola. 2 years later, they had another baby boy who they named Vincent Anthony. In June 1971, Frank, along with his friend Joseph Miltier, broke into the Princess Anne Equipment Company in Portsmouth. They were arrested and convicted, and Frank was sentenced to 4 years in prison. During this time in prison, he would often demonstrate unusual behaviour in an attempt to show other inmates just how macho he was. It is reported that he would eat live spiders, swallow razor blades, and on one occasion had tried to gulp down a dead bird just to show the others that he was not afraid of anything. He served just over a year before being released on parole, and a divorce from Alice soon followed. Alice retained custody of their boys and soon remarried. Less than 2 years later, Frank had also remarried. His new wife, Karen Evans, was 3 years his junior and was reported to be very easily influenced by her husband. In the spring of 1978, Frank found out about the Hatchell family. 45-year-old Muriel and 55-year-old Peyton had been married for about 5 years. Peyton ran a successful car dealership in Newport News, Virginia. Frank had discovered that Peyton often stored cash from this business at his home in Matoka Lane, Deer Park. In mid-April 1978, Frank knocked on the door of Muriel and Peyton's house. He was dressed as a priest and tried to gain entry into the house by telling them that his car had broken down. Muriel refused to let him in. Not to be deterred, Frank decided that he needed a different plan. A few days later, on Saturday 22nd of April 1978, a friend of Frank's, Donna Mills, went to the house again, this time on the premise of delivering some roses. Once Donna had gained access to the property, she pulled a gun from the bouquet and pointed it at Muriel. Donna then let Frank and Joseph into the house. Donna held Muriel down in her bedroom while Frank and Joseph searched the house for money. When they were unsuccessful, the two men bound Muriel with Venetian blind cords and then struck her in the head and face before repeatedly slamming her head into the floor, all the time demanding that she tell them where the money was hidden. At one point, it is believed that Frank also tried to choke Muriel. At approximately 6 p.m, Peyton arrived home from work. As he walked in the door, Muriel was still being beaten. He was assaulted and struck violently on the head with what is believed to have been a pistol. The gang decided to run. They left, taking $3,100 in cash and rings which Donna had yanked off of Muriel's fingers. What they never realised was that during their search of the house, they had missed over $17,000 which had been hidden in a makeup bag in Muriel's handbag. Frank, Joseph and Donna fled the scene in Peyton's 1976 Ford LTD sedan and met up with Frank's wife Karen, who was waiting in a rented getaway car a short distance away. Meanwhile, Peyton managed to stumble from the house and was spotted by a neighbour who called the emergency services. The neighbour rushed to the house to assist Muriel and found her still tied up. The neighbour untied Muriel in an attempt to help her. However, by the time the emergency services arrived, Muriel was already dead. A later autopsy revealed that she had died from a brain hemorrhage and from choking on her own vomit. Peyton had a fractured skull which had to be repaired with a steel plate. He managed to give police a description of his attackers before being rushed into surgery. Later that evening, Peyton's car was recovered less than a mile away from the scene of the crime. On Monday, 24th of April, police arrested 4 suspects, 2 men and 2 women. Joseph and Donna were charged with murder and held without bail, but the other 2, a woman by the name of Jody Lee Harrell and a man called Clinton Prince, were released without charge. Following an intensive police investigation, Frank and Karen were arrested over 2 weeks later at around 9 p.m. on Monday, 8th of May 1973. Neither of them resisted arrest. The murder and trial received substantial publicity. Joseph and Donna both testified that Frank was the killer. They all received separate trials. Joseph's trial finished first. Whilst he was still implicated in the beating of Muriel, it was widely accepted that Frank had been the ringleader. Joseph was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. On 26th of September 1978, Frank was also found guilty of first-degree murder. On that same day he received his sentence, death by electric chair. In March 1982, 4 years after his trial, Frank waived his right to any further appeals, stating that he wanted to spare his family any more hardship and heartbreak. He asked for the state to carry out his death sentence, with his only request being for it to be completed after the school term had finished, to try to spare his 2 sons, who were teenagers at the time, any additional trauma. Frank had no wish to continue living in the conditions he endured on death row. At that time, death row inmates at the Mecklenburg State Prison were held in solitary cells for all but 15 minutes in every 24-hour period. During his time there, Frank had even assisted in initiating a lawsuit which was brought by the American Civil Liberties Union, which challenged the living conditions at the prison. Prior to the execution date, Frank was transferred from Mecklenburg Prison to the penitentiary in Richmond. Despite a stay of execution plea presented by lawyers on the basis that his appalling living conditions had made it impossible for him to make a rational decision, the execution was scheduled for 11 p.m. on Tuesday the 10th of August 1982. Frank refused a special meal, then spoke with a Roman Catholic priest who he asked to look after his family. He then walked willingly to the electric chair in the basement of the penitentiary. He was reported to be very calm and composed. 2 55-second charges of electricity had to be used to complete the execution. It is reported that the second jolt caused Frank's head and leg to catch on fire. Smoke and the smell of burning flesh filled the death chamber. 38-year-old Frank was the first person to be executed in Virginia since 1962 and only the 5th to be executed in the US after the death penalty was reintroduced. He maintained his innocence until his dying day. Peyton recovered from his extensive head injury, but 11 years later in 1989 died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 66 years old. Joseph died in prison in 1999 at the age of 56. I've been unable to find any additional information about Donna Mills, but she is presumably still in prison. Karen Coppola was sentenced to 55 years as an accessory to murder, but this was later reduced to 20 years. It is believed that she was released from prison sometime in the 1990s and reportedly remarried. I'd like to say a massive thank you to Steph Carlo for recommending this one, and also for your patience. You've asked for this one a long time ago, and you also did some research for me and supplied me with a lot of information, so thank you for that, Steph. Please add any comments down below. As usual, I'll always be interested reading them. Thank you once again for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. As well as this Frank Coppola, there was a very famous mafia boss called Frank Coppola as well. Obviously, they're different people. Goodbye.